You're listening to Counselors on the Couch, an open conversation between counselors, coaches, and specialists discussing how people just like you can solve a multitude of challenges. Counselors on the Couch is hosted by Dr. Chuck Carrington. We invite you now to join us on the couch to listen in as Dr. Chuck and his specialist guests and experts candidly share insider information on how they help solve the problems that drive people into counseling.
Welcome back, my friends, to another day on the couch. I trust your week has been a blessed one. James?
Yeah, it's been great.
Say more about that.
Well, I mean, we're finally starting to get some cool weather, and it's turning into fall.
Fall weather's awesome. How you doing, Kathy?
Good. Good week this week, yeah. Got a visit from my daughter yesterday, which is always fun. So.
It's fun. So we spent a lot of time so far discussing the external stress and the internal grief of divorce. But so far, we've not really focused on what happens on a day-to-day basis throughout the process. So I'd like to do that now by tackling the most common and perhaps the strongest feeling, other than grief, that comes with divorce, one that is visible to most everyone, and that's anger. And I'm sure you've both seen many different forms of anger expressed in the work you do in groups. Before I describe where anger originates, I thought perhaps that you could each speak a little bit about the different ways that you've seen anger manifest in people.
I'd say one of the biggest ways is initially tears, just tears and just the outpouring of, the anger just comes out, I've had one person actually talk about wanting to hire a hit squad. So it's palpable. You can feel it in the room. And we know that anger makes us very uncomfortable being around it. So a lot of it is just an explosion of emotions. It can be tears. It can be loudness.
You said it's palpable in the room. I think that's a good way to describe it. It brings an energy into the room that everybody can feel, even if they don't know what they're feeling. What about you, James? What have you seen in group in anger?
Oh, a lot of tears. But it's interesting, as people go through the anger takes on a variety of different expressions. There's the anger of shock. There's the anger of embarrassment. There's the anger of shame. There's the anger of betrayal. There's the anger of injustice. All of these initially are mostly expressed outwardly. What I see, though, over time is that if it's not handled appropriately or dealt with in a healthy manner, that external anger then gets turned inward. And it turns the person, instead of them expressing the anger is an expression of them. And so they become victims and they become bitter and they become depressed. But it's all due to the anger of what they're going through. The other thing is, too, and I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail, the anger is somewhat amorphous in that you can get to a point where you are angry, but you can't really identify what you're angry about. You're just angry. You're a little off center, a little off kilter all the time, because the anger is really hard to define sometimes. It's really hard to understand why you're angry. You wake up in the mornings and you're angry. You go to bed at night and you're angry. It's almost like being on hyperdrive. In that, it can really take over your psyche, it can take over your emotions, and it can become a way of life.
Anger can become a habit. It can actually become comfortable for people because it's one thing they feel like they can do.
Well, in the midst of all of this, it is something they can feel. Because in many cases, divorce is so draining and so mind-numbing. The absence of feeling sometimes is scary. And at least with the anger, you feel something versus feeling completely isolated, completely disconnected, completely alone. At least you're feeling something.
And sometimes you really should feel angry, because being angry is a signal that something's not right. Something is off, something is wrong. So even like you were saying, James, in the numbness of it, it's something that triggers us to take action sometimes. Sometimes we need to take appropriate actions. it's not always a negative thing. It's something that we have to evaluate, as far as the source of the anger. And if we can think at the time that we're angry, which is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to actually use your brain. It's telling you, you need to look at this. Something is amiss here. So you don't, versus dismissing the anger, you can use it as a tool to help you, to signal you that you need to think about something. You need to figure something out.
I think that's a really good point, Kathy. Yeah, I look at anger sort of like looking at a temperature. Average body temperature is 98.6. If you have a temperature of 100, the temperature of 100 won't hurt you, okay? But it's an indication that something's wrong, okay? Because you got a fever, right? If you're angry within levels of moderation, the anger itself won't hurt you. It's an indication that something's wrong. Now, if you get a fever of 103 or 104, there's a very big chance you can go into febrile seizures. And that can cause serious brain injury and serious body injury. Same thing with anger. If your anger gets out of control and gets too hot, which you may have heard people say, boy, he was really hot about that one. Well, it's a similar analogy. If it gets too high, it can create a lot of damage.
You just handed me a great segue. I love it. So from my perspective, I deal with people who deal with anger all the time in counseling. Anger is very personal. Some people can be very reasonable and managed in their anger because there's nothing wrong with anger per se. It's a valid emotion. God gets angry, but he tells us in our anger not to sin. And that's what you're talking about. When the anger takes hold of you, instead of you controlling it, there's a big problem. It can become extremely debilitating for some people. It can lead to extreme behavior. With anger, it all depends on the source. That's what drives it. And like you just said, both of you just said, if you're too angry, you might not know what the source is. When you're living in the back of your brain, where the emotions are, if it's too strong, the front of your brain gets cut off. You can't be angry and rational at the same time if your anger is out of control.
Well, and that's what I meant by when I said that, anger is amorphous. It has no definable shape. It has no definable substance. It has no definable components. It's this thing that you feel, and you feel very, very strongly. You talked about in the back of your brain, and let's back up for a moment because, your brain's really made up of three parts. The front of your brain is your thinking brain. The middle of your brain is your emotional brain. And the hind part of your brain is the reptilian brain, which is where the fight or flight response occurs. So, anger starts in the middle. The question is, which way is it going to go? Is it going to go to the front part of your brain where you have a chance to try to start to understand what you're angry about and deal with the underlying issues? Or is it going to go to the back part of your brain, which is going to put you into a fight or flight mode? And when it goes to the back part of your brain, that's when people end up being abusive, and that's when they end up hurting themselves and others, and that's when they do things that they end up regretting later. And people can get so angry that they will do things and they will not remember what they did, which is a true phenomenon because there's so little energy going to the front part of their brain that there's no cognitive ability going on. And so they're working simply out of the most primitive part of their brain. And so they don't remember because you can't be that angry and think at the same time. It's not possible. It's not physiologically or psychologically possible to do that.
That is exactly right. And so most of our listeners already have heard this, at least I believe everybody's probably heard this, that anger is a secondary emotion. We hear that all the time in groups and counseling and such. It's the result of another feeling. My favorite professor when I was in grad school used to say that when you see anger, you flip it over, look underneath, you're going to find hurt. Anger is an expression of hurt, and hurt comes from someplace else. Often, though, hurt produces fear before it produces anger, and that can trigger that fight or flight response just as much as the anger can. When we have a core feeling, something that is basic to our needs and our expectations, feelings such as betrayal, abandonment, loneliness, being used, unloved, scared, humiliated, all these different feelings, these are core feelings. When they are triggered in us, it produces a reaction. These emotions they represent primary needs in our lives. Primary needs would be like needing to be loved or needing to be valued or be respected or be safe. Sometimes fear arises when these needs are not being met, or this reaction to injustice when we've been violated somehow. These are the sources of anger. When a core feeling has been triggered and it's not dealt with either by you or by the person who caused it, if you can't get it remedied, that's when it leads to hurt. So core feelings flow along this continuum. It's an expression of other emotions which start to leak out, and we start to lose the battle against those primary emotions. In other words, something happens to us, we have a feeling about it, we feel hurt. And when that hurt doesn't resolve, we start getting frustrated. I had this neat little behavior chain I just gave to Kathy. It comes from a group called Feelings Unlimited. It's actually targeting kids, but I use it with adults all the time. And it shows these core hurts and how you get resentful and then you get angry and it progresses. It shows the continuum. We all go through this. When hurt's not resolved, we get frustrated. When frustration gets too big to deal with anyway, we become angry. When frustration becomes too big to deal with, it becomes anger. Before I get into that process, maybe we can hear some examples of certain common emotional needs can produce anger responses, such as humiliation, things like that. So let's hear some perspectives if you can.
When, one of the things you mentioned on this, like I said, as far as the idea of loneliness, yes, and all that, but one of is the idea, a couple of key things are when people feel rejected or abandoned. Okay. And in that, they lose the ability to feel safe. That ties in with feeling safe. And so it triggers something in you. And yes, there's hurt there, but I think fear, it's sometimes to get over fear, you become angry. You're hurt and all that, but in order to deal with that fear, because that fear can be so strong, but rejection is probably one of the biggest things that people are upset about. And also, as far as, like I said, the idea of what they thought was their safe life, regardless of the dynamics of the marriage, whether it be good or bad, it was a safe place because they knew it. And then all of a sudden, they don't have that. So anger comes out of that because they're afraid of the change that comes with leaving that place, that safe place I don't want to use the word safe. I would say the place that they know. Familiar. The place you're familiar with. And you have to open that door and step out of there, or you're shoved out the door, whichever way it happens. It's like all of a sudden, so fear, it's like I'm falling. It's almost like the sense of falling. So the fear comes in there. And then you look at, but I didn't do this. They did. And so the anger comes out. Sometimes the person becomes the culprit, the cause of your hurt, your anger, your fear. And so your anger, you react in, the reaction is getting angry at them. They did this to me, is basically it,
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the feedback loop that goes on between the midbrain and the hindbrain. There's a threat of some sort. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that threat creates fear. That fear then goes to the hind part of your brain and says, okay, I got two choices. I'm going to fight or I'm going to flee. Some people just crush under the weight. Mm-hmm. They get frozen in fear. They would like to flee, but they're too afraid to flee. So they just get stuck. Others, however, decide they're going to fight. And that fight comes out as anger. It's all driven out of the fear associated with the losses and the meaning of the losses that they're experiencing. But, one of the things about anger is that when you're angry, it certainly diminishes your feelings of being a victim. Mm-hmm. It diminishes your feelings of being abused. It diminishes your feelings of not being in control. Mm-hmm. It diminishes your feelings of something happening to you instead of you making something happen. It's a very maladaptive way of dealing with the total chaos that's going on in your life at this point. And so, and that feedback loop can be very reinforcing. So much so that it can be hard to break out of that anger, because at least when you are angry, you feel some modicum of control
and power.
And power.
Because fear robs you of your power.
Yeah. But yet when you're going through a divorce, so much of it is that you're powerless. These things, whether it's your fault or the other person's fault or nobody's fault, these things have happened to you. You know, you're having to go see a lawyer, and the lawyer is telling you what it's going to cost. You know, it's very easy to slip into a victim type status, but the anger is empowering, and it can become very addictive and almost another form of, you know, as an analogy, it can be almost like a drug. It is a way to manage your pain, because when you're angry, you don't feel the pain of the loss. In fact, you're trying to avoid the pain by using what little power you think you may have to actually gain something that, you know, you may have lost. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the anger can be very, very dangerous. It is real. It is a real feeling. The question is what are you going to do with it? And it's a natural human emotion. You know, Jesus got angry, but yet the Bible says, be angry and sin not. But in order to not to sin with your anger, you've got to understand where the anger is coming from, which forces you back to the front part of your brain so that you can be cognitive. And so that when you have to separate, you know, the action reaction to a point that you can insert some reasoning in there to break up that self-reinforcing cycle. And that's not an easy thing to do.
It's not, but it's necessary. And you have to grow to the level that you can shut off that fight or flight response and go back to the cognitive. You said a moment ago, and I want to build on it, but I want to give Kathy an opportunity to weigh in if she'd like. But you were talking about the fight or flight response versus the emotion versus the cognitions. Anger is like your temperature analogy. It's the first outward sign that something's going out of control.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Before we build on what James just said, Kathy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
As far as anger, one of the things that we have that comes up as we've talked about is sometimes you're angry because you're right and they're wrong. And so it's like, because you know this something's not true. And so you're holding on to that. But if you insist on the importance of fighting to be right, sometimes you have to let that go. You can know that you're right, but why is it that your marriage is breaking apart? But so many times we still think we have some control over the other person, you know? And it's like, well, you couldn't control them while you were married to them. Why do you think you can control them now? And so we hang on to this thing. Well, I know I'm right, so I can't let it go. And that keeps us in the dance with this person, this dance you got going on with this person, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But why do we put so much emphasis on wanting this person? I remember many, many years ago, so my daughter told me yesterday, Mom, do you realize next year it's going to be 30 years since you left Dad? And I went, oh. Anyways, but I remember saying to people at that time with everything that was going on, you know, if he would just look at me and admit what a blankety blank to blank he is, I would feel much better, you know? So I needed to be right. He is a jerk and he needs to admit it to me, but who the heck's going to do that? So one of the things they tell us is sometimes even you can be right and still let that other person think that you're wrong. That's part of the when you get divorced in healing, the letting go of the other person is amazing. And anger is one of those things also that keeps you tied to that person. It keeps you chained to that person. And I think I might have mentioned earlier, anger is like drinking poison, hoping the other person will die. And so, like you were saying, James, it is so cool when a person can reach that point in the healing process of recognizing when an emotion is there and just taking that moment of recognition and saying, you know, I'm really angry right now. It actually does pull you a little bit forward. So there's lots of little tricks you can learn along the way that you as far as controlling these things. But I just went on and on about this.
It's okay. That was good. And what you're talking about is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people have heard of, I think, by now. It's understanding what the emotion is, where it comes from, why it's erupting, and then making decisions about what you want to do with it. And then you also use that process to understand other people. But you're right. It builds up. It can become, I need that. What you just described is your need for justice has been violated. Okay. You're not being validated in the moment. You are being victimized. That does bring up hurt, which produces anger. The problem with anger is it builds and it tries to take over. Okay, so it's not having anger that's the problem. It's what we do with it that's the problem. We can have anger, examine it, use emotional intelligence to understand and then move it along. Or we can hang on to it desperately and let it metastasize. And what happens is if you don't deal with the anger properly, it moves to fury. And when you're furious, you've lost control of your anger. And fury, when it's not dealt with, leads to the next step, which is bitterness, which is anger turned inward, which we see as depression. In fact, if you take it one step further, it leads to suicide. That's the ultimate expression of anger against self. Or it can turn to rage, which would be aggression. That's when you land your anger on other people. And if you took that to the ultimate extreme, that would be homicide. So anger, once it's out of control, puts us on a very destructive path. We destroy ourselves, we destroy others. Sometimes we do both.
And that's a really good point, Chuck. You know, Jesus said, don't let the sun set on your anger. Deal with it in the day because it can become very easily a tsunami. You had a tsunami in Japan a few years ago from an earthquake. And people who were out in the ocean, the waves just came underneath them. They were in a boat. They didn't even know that there was a tsunami. But when it hit the shoreline, you know, and the one in Thailand as well on Christmas Day several years ago, it was devastating. And it just came out of nowhere. And that's the way angry people are. There's this energy and this rage that's inside of them that is building. And all they need is just something to be triggered. And it's a gross expression, extreme expression of what has been building in them for days, weeks, months, and years. It's disproportional to the current situation, and it's hugely destructive. They themselves may not even know where it came from.
You know, you're talking about building. There are people out there that we euphemistically call injustice collectors. They've had enough injustices done to them that are legitimate that they become hypervigilant to any injustice. So if you're in a marriage that's in decay and you happen to be the one who's being imposed upon or intruded upon constantly in your safety or your values or whatever your needs are, you start to notice those injustices. And because they keep coming, instead of letting them go, they start to build up. It's like a bank account. And you collect these injustices and you collect them and you collect them and you let them become more important than they would have been individually, and they begin to fester. And it doesn't take much when you're full of anger repressed in this memory to trigger it into your tsunami.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much. You know, in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about keeping no record of wrong. That's part of love. We don't keep a record of wrong. But you'll probably notice in your divorce group, there are a lot of records of wrong that gets recited. Okay? It's because they've gone from anger to fury because they've collected so much data and they can't let go of it. Because if you let go of all those injustices and you don't feel secure in yourself, you're going to feel like you're losing your power, your control, and you're being violated. And there's this human need not to let go.
And the vast majority of people who can describe a litany of injustices in their lives, it's always injustices done to them, but they have a very poor perception of the injustices that they did to the other person.
Oh my gosh, that. Yes. I heard somebody say once, we judge others on their behavior. We judge ourselves on our intent. We don't have the grace for other people that we give to ourselves, but we're just as guilty as others about intruding in their lives. And even if the divorce is 90% the other person's fault, nobody's without blame. In a divorce. We all have a piece of it.
That is one of the things, though, that actually in the group that people get angry when we bring that up. in some ways. Is saying, if you're looking at this, part of letting go of your anger is when you can start to own your part. You can own your part in this. And it could be that they are 90% and you are 10%. It could be 50-50. But the idea is all of a sudden it's taking your eyes off that other person as far as being the target, so to speak, of the situation. And because we emphasize, this is about you. This is about you healing. And as long as you're tied to that other person in any way, it inhibits your healing. And anger does that. It keeps you shackled to them. So letting go is probably one of the key things that helps you with the anger, with the depression, with all those things of that, is letting go. People don't want to let go because they feel justified. And so in time, as they get little bits and pieces coming to them in the process of, if they are invested in becoming healthy and whole, they will start to let go of the things that keep them from moving in that direction. But that's a hard step. And sometimes you'll see somebody that'll go on for months like that and just can't get past it. But all of a sudden, there'll be a little click. You'll see it'll click with them. They're going, oh, but it's so freeing. It is so freeing to do that. But on the other side of the coin, you acknowledge the fact that, yes, you are justified in being angry. And you acknowledge to yourself, I'm justified in being angry. What do I want? How do I want to live my life? And then you make a decision as far as choosing healing over being right. Because one of the things I talk about, sometimes being right, you have to be, is what keeps you tied to that anger, and so you let go. There's a lot of letting go in this process.
Yeah. Kathy, I was sitting here thinking as you were talking, in divorce, you can be happy or you can be right, but you can't be both. Okay? You can't be both. Divorce brings out the worst of human nature. And you see this between two people. You even see it, on a global scale in countries. The Germans hated the Jews. The Serbians hated the Bosnians. It leads to genocide. It leads to mass killings and murder. The same thing is with this anger. You've murdered the person in your mind. And even Jesus talked about that. If you hate your brother, you've committed murder. I think he understood that. The point, though, is that you can get to a place where you've healed so much that it just doesn't matter anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because the value of being happy, the value of being at peace, the value of being whole is so much greater than the injustice or the need to be right all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You can be right. You can be proven right. It's a very hollow victory. And it doesn't heal your pain. And it doesn't release the emotions. And it doesn't free you from the situation or from the other person. Only you can do that. And you just have to let it go. And you let it go through forgiveness and through a lot of forgiving yourself, forgiving others as well. But it's so hard for us to look at ourselves when there's an easy target out there for us to look at instead.
Well, it's like any other tragedy that happens in your life. If somebody dies in an untimely way, we look for something to blame.
Mm-hmm.
If we get in an auto accident, we look to see who we can blame for causing it. If we have an emotional eruption, we have to have someone to target and say this is their fault, because that's our nature, is to look for blame, because it lets us justify or understand. We have a saying in psychology and counseling, it's hurting people hurt other people. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of uncontrolled anger is oftentimes the angry person is looking for someone to wound because they want other people to see their anger. I think, James, you said it to me once. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Yep. I like that. When you're angry and you have a lot of injustices stored up and you feel like you are right and you're not getting justice, then every injustice looks like a nail to you and you're going to hit it.
Yeah.
So this anger takes on a life of its own.
Yes.
And it becomes your focus. And so you can't see anything else out there. And it's just amazing because it becomes such a power in your life. And it's hard when you're in that place, where you're angry, you think that's where you're going to be forever, for one thing. You can't, that's how you see life. That's the reality that you live in. And so you can't imagine what it would be like not to be angry, if that makes any sense. And so somewhere along the way, there has to be a place where that front brain clicks in and you grab at it and you hold on to that and you start to process this, because you can never talk somebody out of being angry. It's not like you can point out, well, this. No, it's a process they have to go through.
Yeah, you can't reason with them.
No.
Because all the energy is going to the middle and the back part of their brain. And in order for them to reason, that has to go to the front part of their brain. So you can't talk to an angry person.
It's like saying you can't be calm and agitated at the same time. No. They don't work.
No.
Same thing with anger. Anger takes on a life of its own. And two ways that maybe would surprise people. One is anger is a substitution for the intimacy of love. It's still an intimate relationship with that ex. And a lot of people hang on to the relationship they lost. They don't want to deal with the loss of the relationship. So they hang on to it with anger because it forces the relationship to stay in the forefront of their mind. It can also be, in certain ways, it can be an addiction. You can become addicted to anger because being angry and lobbing it at people moves you closer to what you believe is your goal of getting justice. And it's going to give you a dopamine release because you feel like you're winning. And so anger is something you can grab a hold of and say, I'm powerful now. And it reinforces that irrational belief. It's not rational, but it seems rational. So anger takes on a life of its own. It not only does that, it takes on your life. It takes it over.
And the other thing, too, is that anger, at least in very close relationships, is a form of intimacy. It's a poor substitute for healthy intimacy, but it's still a force of intimacy because it forces the other person in their own defense to say things to you and reveal things to you that they might not otherwise.
Sometimes it's not true what they tell you either, because in anger, we tend to react and we say some egregious things. So you may not even get the answer you're looking for. You may just get more fuel.
You know, you could do a 12-week podcast on anger alone.
Oh.
You know, there's so many facets of it. And anger lies to you.
Just like an addiction.
Yeah, anger lies to you in the sense that it's warped. You know, it warps your sense of reality, as I mentioned earlier. But so we have people that most people that go through divorce at some point or another are going to be angry. Some people deny that they're angry, and because of the fact that they've just turned it all inside them. So it's all their fault, and it takes a while sometimes for them to recognize that it's not all their fault.
But then they're angry at themselves.
Yeah, which is the other side of making the ex-spouse or be the total blame.
I think you made a really good point in that you said anger lies to you. And part of the reason that anger lies to you is because anger sees the world very black and white. Anger sees the world as all or nothing. Okay. And so when you're going through a divorce and you're angry, it's all their fault and you had nothing to do with it. And that's not reality. You know, two people got married, two people got divorced. There's plenty of blame to share with both parties. And it's not about 49-51 or even 90-10. The fact is that you failed. And you've got to come to grips with your own failure. But anger prevents you from doing that because it won't allow you to look at yourself. All it does is force you to look at the other person. Or you turn it inward and then you are 100% wrong and the other person had no role to play at all, which isn't the truth either.
We see that in battered person syndrome, where somebody has assumed all responsibility for the other person's behavior as well as their own. And so therefore they feel like they deserve the punishment and they become embittered and turn it and depressive, and they lose all their power.
Yeah.
The angry person is trying to gain power, and the depressed person seems to be giving it up.
And in that aspect, it's be it battered physically or emotionally. You really believe that it's almost like in that case, anger's a good thing. When they start to feel, if anger is treated properly, if anger, the mechanism of anger is used properly, it can be such a positive thing. We hear anger and we think negative, but it can actually be a positive thing because sometimes if that's what gets a person out of the self-blame is all of a sudden the anger of realizing, no, I'm not. But anger isn't just when you're going through divorce. We're talking about it in that stage here. It's all throughout your life that you're going to have an opportunity to get angry.
Well, mismanagement of anger in marriage can be the reason the divorce came up in the first place. I'm reminded of a story that James was telling me the other day. Anger acts like a check engine light. You were working on your daughter's car and her check engine light was on. When you see anger, it's the warning light comes on. You're supposed to get out your code reader and figure out what's wrong. And if you do it before anything bad happens, then you can get to the root of the problem because you can still be cognitive. You can still think. It's when you ignore that warning light for too long and then bad things happen. Now you have a catastrophic failure out of your control.
Yeah, my hope is like if people are listening to the podcast is that they learn, it's becoming familiar with anger, learning anger, understanding anger, taking the mystery out of anger. Taking this and using this opportunity to say, wow, you know what? You may see yourself in some of the things that we're mentioning today, but wow, okay, I'm going to take this and I'm going to take advantage and I'm going to learn from this and I'm going to consciously watch myself. And if I start to find out when you start to get triggered, start to recognize those when the trigger starts, and then have a plan of like, if you're meeting with them or something like that, have a plan. Okay, when this starts, before I get ramped up all the way or pushed back all the way to that reptilian brain, I'm going to do this when this trigger starts. The recognition of that is very helpful to.
That's why I say it's basically like an addiction. That's the same process we use when dealing with addictions, is we have to know what the triggers are to the external events that drive the behaviors. Okay, so we pretty much covered, without even going there yet, we've covered depression, we've covered the aggression, the bitterness, the rage, pretty thoroughly. And I think that it's clear now that anger is the midpoint in the chain. It's not the end of the chain. It's the midpoint, and it's not in and of itself a bad thing.
No.
It's when it goes out of control and goes to fury and bitterness and rage that it becomes destructive. So we don't have to fear anger. We should appreciate the fact that God's given us this warning light, that when anger comes up, something has gone wrong, and we just have to figure out what it is. And a lot of times anger is justifiable. It's appropriate.
And it's a warning.
It is a warning.
Like we've said that. I think that's come up a few times here because it's, especially when you mentioned like abusive relationships like that, that's one thing too, is, if a person sometimes doesn't realize they're in an abusive situation until after they leave. That was my case. I didn't realize that. But if you're in an abusive relationship, that anger if that anger comes up in you, can actually be a good thing to motivate you to take a look at it. And it
moves you to action.
Yes.
But you want the action you move towards to be a healthy.
Right.
James mentioned earlier maladaptive behavior. So maladaptive behavior is simply an adaptation to that stimuli. And when it's maladaptive, it's a misplaced adaptation. It's hurtful to you. Where a healthy adaptation is, okay, I feel angry. Why? What do I need to change in me? Or what do I need to remove? What influences are in my life that are not healthy for me? And do I need to remove them? So there's a lot of ways you can deal with anger. Just for the sake of time, because I know we're running short, I wanted to talk about some of the beliefs that commonly lead to anger during a divorce that might alternate between rage and bitterness. Some of these, maybe these injustices, or some of the things that we look at, like division of assets, infidelities, false allegations, child custody, things like that, spousal support. These are common issues that tend to lead to anger because of the conflicts they produce. So maybe you can give a little bit of advice on how you help people deal with or cope with these otherwise very adversarial topics?
One of the biggest things that comes to mind here is you're saying that sometimes it's just unfair. We don't look at, if people go to the court system hoping for justice, that doesn't always happen. And a big thing for me in this is the fact that you get to this point where these are real things that are happening to you, be it with the division of assets, with child support, with child custody, with infidelity and all those things like that. These are real. And sometimes it is not. Unfortunately, it's just not going to be fair. And in that particular case, the only thing that I could say to do at that point in time, you got to take that to God. You've got to say, because it's out of your hands, and you take it to Him and say, God, this is not right. My child, I can't have my child with me because of the lies that he told, and these are justifiable reasons to be angry and all that. But it comes back to being right in this situation, being right. I'm trying to think of how to word this. But sometimes, to me, it is just a simple matter of stopping and saying, no, there's nothing, this is not fair. There's nothing that I can do about it. It is out of my hands. And then you place your trust in God to help you walk through this and to heal from this. Because sometimes you can't change the situation.
Scripture says sometimes we need to suffer ourselves to be defrauded. I know that's intended to be applied towards fellow believers, but there's wisdom in that. Sometimes the fight for justice will take more out of you and put you into a place of sin. And sometimes we just have to say, you know what? It's not fair, but I can deal with that.
Yeah. And that's part of when you think about it, that's part of the healing process, because that letting go is what's going to enable you to focus on your healing. And in this, we're so distracted by our anger, by the injustices, by everything that's going on, we can't heal. So the best, if you're really angry at a person, the best revenge you can get is to get healthy and whole.
Well, they say the best revenge is to live well.
Yeah.
We're doing a marriage webinar right now on, we call it Reconciled, and it's reconciled. The root words mean to be made friendly again. And one of the things we've done is we created these power convictions. There's 4 of them in our seminar. And one of them is to look at the ideal of the marriage that you want. What do you want from this relationship? Or in this case, what do you want from your soon-to-be ex? And then look at yourself and say, and am I living it myself? Because if you live it out yourself, then you could have that reasonable expectation. If you want your spouse to do X, Y, and Z, then you should live that out first. So I think that anger, when we recognize that we can control ourselves and we're responsible for our part, even if it's just a small part, but we take on the responsibility of our own self, our own anger, then we can get ourselves under control. And then if the spouse doesn't, that's okay, because you are divorcing. The relationship is ending. You are separating. You don't have to live that anymore. But if you continue to live it, then you never really are divorced. You're still bound, dragging that corpse around behind you.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about divorce is it is so much the antithesis of, if you look at the day you get divorced and the day you get married, they are so much the antithesis of each other. The day you get married, you're joining with a person. You have all these hopes and dreams of the future. You have all these plans and goals that you want to try to accomplish. But you know that it's going to take you a lifetime to get all those things done. The day you get divorced, it's like you're trying to live an entire lifetime in a moment in time. Everything gets compressed. And it's very, very hard to see life beyond that, because it is a death. And emotionally, the death is such that many times you don't think there's life beyond this. That's where the intensity of the emotions come from. You're fighting for just basic survival, the right to exist. If you can take a step back, though, and realize that life goes on, I think it's Jeremiah where it talks about, where God says, I know the plans I have for you, plans for hope, plans for a good life. The divorce is a moment in time. It is, and yes, it's the end of the marriage. And yes, you will be different. Life as you have known it up until that point in time is over. And you've got to redefine what life after that looks like. But by the time you get to this point, it is already over. And what you're dealing with are the aftermath of the corpse of what remained from the marriage. The energy is much more well spent, as Kathy said, in becoming healed and accepting where you are and building a vision for a new future of yourself. Anger robs you of that. Anger prevents you from being able to do that. Anger says that when this is over, so are you. That you have no future. You have no hope. When the judge issues the decree, not only is it the pronouncement of death for the marriage, but it's the pronouncement of death for you as well. But that's just not true. That's just not true. You have a life beyond this. As Kathy said, and this is not about revenge, but to spend that energy and time on healing yourself, becoming whole, dealing with your issues on your side of the line is a much better use of your time, your limited energy, and your limited resources than fighting over who's going to get the silverware.
Yeah. And we want to validate, you have every right to be angry. You are not wrong to be angry. But do you want to be right? Or do you want to be made whole again? So making that choice of, because I think part of it is I think validation is a big part of our healing process when people hear. And I think that's one of the reasons, the benefits for a support group, because they see and they hear other people say things that, oh my gosh, I didn't think anybody else thought that. But it's the idea that this is about healing. This is about understanding all the different things that come about when you're going through a breakup of a family and learning. Hopefully people will stick with it.
So next week, we're going to be discussing probably one of the easiest and most effective ways to deal with anger. We're going to be talking about how to establish healthy boundaries and to negotiate the divorce in your heart, settle into the new life. Boundaries are essential to all healthy relationships, and a boundary tells you where you stop and other people begin. Anger blurs that line. Boundaries that are well enforced tell others where they must stop as well, so they don't intrude on you. So next week, we're talking boundaries versus control. Some anger controls, boundaries protect. So Kathy and James, I want to thank you, first of all, for bringing your experience and some of this hard-earned wisdom to the listeners. I know this is not always fun to think back on what you've gone through, but I find it very valuable. Before we sign off, do you have any closing remarks or any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I want to go back for a moment. We've talked a lot about anger, and I know the times in the past when I was really, really angry. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to define it. I didn't know how to put my finger on it. It was it's like a ghost. It is so present and so palpable, but yet I couldn't really see it. It had no mass. It was something that would slip through my fingers. I couldn't get my hands around it. And, and you and I had a discussion about this, and you really taught me, that anger was a secondary emotion. And so when you look at that construct in light the way your brain works, that going to the back part of your brain, just enhances the emotion, enhances that flight, enhances the adrenaline, that's surging through your body. Versus if you go to the front part of your brain and go to the cognitive side, it actually diminishes the adrenaline levels. And it actually is where the problem-solving aspects of your brain exist. So one of the things that you taught me, Chuck, and that I learned to do is that when I'm angry, what am I angry about? If I can go beneath the anger and start to understand, well, am I angry because I was rejected? Am I angry because I was abandoned? Am I angry because of the injustice? And then start to deal with that primary emotion. That's where I really experienced a lot of growth, because then it was something then that I could get my hands around.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't flood me like the anger did, because in many ways, when I would get so angry, I actually felt helpless, because I didn't know what to do about it, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But once I started going down and saying, okay, I'm angry because I was abandoned. Well, then I can start asking myself a series of questions. Am I truly abandoned? I have my children. They love me. I have my God. He said he would never leave me or forsake me. He would go with me to the end of the world. He said that he would be my defense. And there's a whole host of scriptures then that once I understand the core emotion, then I can go to God based on what he has said in his word. And now I have a way to start to process the core emotion.
Mm-hmm.
I could never dissipate it. There was nowhere for the energy to go. And there was nothing for me to do with it. So it just felt like this huge ball of energy that was bouncing around like a ball of lightning, creating all kinds of damage, but no way to direct it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So much of that anger, too, sometimes precedes the marriage, and it gets fed by the marriage. And so it can be a really deep source. And so you need to go. I mean, Kathy, you said this earlier. It's not just the divorce that causes anger. Right. Anger is a normal process of living. Mm-hmm. So it works for everybody to deconstruct the anger, to look at the change, to figure out where it's coming from. It's always, always, always a core feeling that produced a hurt reaction that leads to your fear and fury and all those things. Mm-hmm. Do you have any parting thoughts or wisdom for us?
As you're going through a divorce, and it's hard to see it at the time, but going through a divorce and healing from a divorce is like taking a course. But it's a course that you'll be able to apply in so many other aspects of your life. If you give yourself over to it, and allow yourself to be, they talk about you're getting information and you're being formed by this, but then you're being transformed and moving on to being a more of the child of God that God intends you to be. And what we talk about here, like it really just touches the surface of anger. There's so much more to it. And there's a lot of, resources out there for it. So the
most important thing is to have that conversation outside of your head with someone who will listen.
Absolutely.
And be able to offer at least some comfort or some help or some guidance. When you have it in your head, you're going to get into a feedback loop, and it's going to amplify your anger.
Yep.
If any of our listeners would like to know more information about joining a DivorceCare group, you can easily find one in your area by going to DivorceCare.org and searching by your zip code. If you'd like to become part of a divorce support group with us at Virginia Beach Christian Counseling or do personal counseling or coaching, you can navigate to our website at virginiabeachchristiancounseling.com, or you can simply type in myvbcc.com. Guys, I want to thank you. Next week, I think it's going to be great. Boundaries, one of my favorite topics.
Oh, yeah.
I appreciate you being here. Everybody else, you have a great day. Counselors on the Couch is brought to you by Virginia Beach Christian Counseling, specialists in family counseling, grief, trauma, and loss. Find us at www.virginiabeachchristiancounseling.com. Counselors on the Couch is produced and directed by John Bell, executive producer Dr. Chuck Carrington, with original music score and mastering by John Tyler Music. The opinions expressed here are of the host and the individual guests and are not necessarily the opinion of Virginia Beach Christian Counseling. If you would like to make a comment or would like to ask to be a guest, please go to counselorsonthecouch.com.